and welcome to this Business Day TV special as we focus on the G20. I'm Bronwyn Seaborne. Well, South Africa holds the G20 presidency this year, and the hope is that that will put Africa on the global agenda. Joining me to discuss this further is Luthando Vuba, who is the head of international trade at the Business and Commercial Banking Unit at Standard Bank. Luthando, thanks so much for joining us here. It feels like Ramaphosa, in having the G20 presidency, there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of expectation that he will put Africa on the global agenda. Is that expectation unfounded? Are we just expecting too much? Or do you believe it's realistic that we can expect this from him?
Good day, Bronwyn, and good day to your viewers. And thank you for having me. So I think the G20 needs to sort of be taken actually what it is and also just be understood to what is also not. And its policy drives the economic environment, which then helps businesses, investors, all the participants in the economy that needs to invest and grow an economy, which then creates jobs and therefore better welfare in society is then enabled. So that's really what it is. It's a tool, and I think why it is prominent is because this tool is then sort of having a meeting of minds of these top economic powers that account for around, I think, 60% of global GDP. So that's what you have with this opportunity of the South African presidency. And I think what the South African president is having to balance is both our priorities as a sovereign in South Africa, but also what we know is common across the continent. And I think there is a range of resonant challenges, and that's really what I think the balancing act has to be, and hence the focus around the G20 being solidarity, inclusiveness makes sense. It really does, because even further afield in other regions, other emerging markets, this theme around inclusiveness and then solidarity really resonates. I think with everything that we're seeing from a global stage, the shift in supply chains, the shift in geopolitics, we're seeing protectionism going up. It really is a time to really balance, because I think that direction does not help emerging markets, because for developed economies to have gotten to where they are, it was this drive towards multilateralism. So to see that currently under threat is really then, I think, that runway for emerging economies to get to being more developed, making it a bit more than a challenge. And I think the opportunity for the South African presidency is to really resonate everyone around how do we just focus on core areas that maintain the multilateralism and just being balanced where there is imbalanced, and really something that will be more optimal for the emerging economies and see more financial flows into those markets.
You highlighted there we have what is now coming to be known as Trumponomics, and trade really coming to the fore. And at the same time, here in Africa, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which should encourage trade in Africa between African countries. And so it's really a crucial time where we see almost these two concepts trying to be married to each other. Do you think it actually works in the favor of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? Because while, like you highlight, there's this protectionism, there's this inward looking, and so we could see that actually work to the benefit of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Is that really the assessment? Is that correct?
That would be a fair assessment, while I would caution around that assessment being very close to reality. What threatens that reality is just where we find ourselves as the continent in terms of our industrial and infrastructure capacity, which directly is the big one, for me, one of the biggest non-tariff barriers for the rollout of the AfCFTA. And remember, we have the regional economic communities and regional customs unions, which have tried to start to tap into what one of the intentions of the AfCFTA is, right, which is to liberalize trade through zero tariffs on most goods and enable free movement and have protocol around investment, which is a key consideration for even African investors and also offshore. And then when it comes to then particular intention around women and youth participating in this trade, so that intention and vision, I think makes sense. It is completely speaks to, if you look at, Africa being projected to be the youngest population in about 5 to 10 years, and, the what that will mean from a workforce, but also what that workforce must be absorbed into. At the same time, we find ourselves where the requirement for the infrastructure spend for Africa to actually develop, in terms of its infrastructure at the rate that it should, is around $100 billion a year, and we're only doing about 10% of that. So whilst there is spend, it is just adding to the backlog of what should be spent and actually getting infrastructure in place. And there's critical infrastructure that I deem it critical infrastructure, especially when you talk about AfCFTA, road infrastructure, ports, and rail. Road is accounting for about 80% of how we move goods on the continent, which makes it very expensive. Rail is not anywhere in terms of especially integrating with, regionally, but also intra-region. And then our ports capacities currently, one of the major ones that can handle is Durban, and we know the issues that we've had in Durban. So there's these challenges that I think, if you think about, there's a G20 presidency, there's a focus on Africa, there's the AfCFTA, there is, protectionism, etc. In the absence of all of that, there's still, and has to be, a prioritization of how to invest in the infrastructure that better enables the trade. Whilst the policy piece around being able to trade freely is important, it's even more critical to actually get the infrastructure in place, because what it does is also boosts investor confidence in our markets, and I think that's really where the big penny, the big needle needs to move, regardless of what's happening. Whilst obviously there's those engagements, and we're seeing the shifts that are happening around the world. So it is an opportune time, but it's an opportune time that needs to be really steered towards the strategic area around looking at our infrastructure. And
that just speaking to the fact that we need to move at scale. And at speed, right?
Yeah.
If we're really going to make the African Continental Free Trade Agreement work for us.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where the policy piece comes in, right? And if we can harmonize around these critical areas around what we need to shift in policy, it really then gets us, it doesn't become a one voice sort of steering a direction, but it really gets, I think, this theme around, this is what makes sense for emerging economies, therefore South Africa and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And will then get us, to see the reforms that need to take place. We need to also then get better participation and collaboration from, if you think about DFIs, our multilateral development banks, and also land at an environment where the risk understanding of African countries is better, and it's more practical, because the risk premium is directly also impacting how much can be invested, or the investment that we see in some of our African countries. So I think it is a very good opportunity with everything else that's happening to actually just bring everyone to the table and refocus around that theme around solidarity and inclusiveness. Because I think in the global world, that's really what emerging economies and developing economies are, moving towards, to be included in the global agenda, and in how that develops.
Behind it all, some would suggest that what we really need is decisive leadership. Are you seeing that come to the fore?
Decisive leadership, I think we're starting to see it. I think if you look domestically, the reforms that have been put in place and continue to be put in place, there's much more engagement with business, and business closely collaborating with government, and seeing then the outcomes of that. The progress that has been made with Eskom is probably a good example. Progress not fast enough being made with Transnet around the ports and rail, but it is there. It is a much better position than where we were 2 years ago. So I do think that there is a shift, and that decisive leadership is starting to emerge. And I think equally the different stakeholders in the economy, everyone is starting to rally around what are we doing. And I think it's equally important to then look at, like, how do we take everyone along. So I think the role of public-private partnering, whether formally or informally, is going to become very crucial in us getting the dial to really move.
Because do we really risk this becoming just a good idea and that it never actually comes into play because we kind of, like you highlighted, with the infrastructure spend, we keep kind of falling behind. You know, it's a wonderful idea to get everyone together and on the same page, but that takes a lot of work. I think if we look at our government of national unity, we can see just how that plays out. It's really difficult to get everyone on the same page. And so there is this worry that maybe the African Continental Free Trade Agreement just becomes this thing of it was a great idea, and that would be really sad, I guess.
No, indeed. I think when it comes to AfCFTA, what is encouraging is that you have these member states having agreed to sign an agreement, have signed an agreement, therefore agreed to the intentions of the free trade area and what it will realize. And you're slowly starting to see it really being implemented and not just talk with the Guided Trade Initiative, which is a mechanism to identify the countries. It started with a pilot list of countries, around 7, with a certain list of products, and was really bringing these governments together with their business communities to then facilitate the trade, to actually trade under the free trade rules, ensuring that the ratification of those rules with the relevant customs is taking place. And then they got expanded, and that's what also South Africa got included into that. And last year, January, I think the president announced, you know, the trade that was done in the free trade rules. So I think that is what gives me that encouragement that we're not just talking, you know, we are doing. There's the adjustment fund that has been put in place. So the adjustment fund is really to say, some economies will be impacted more to then liberalize these tariffs, right? And therefore, there is then a fund to then compensate that revenue that that country would be particularly dependent on. And I think what the good work that they've done is to actually then map out, you know, the African countries and the ones that are most impacted, whereas least development are then should be the higher beneficiaries of that. And I think that's a good mechanism to bring balance into that, because the AfCFTA also then could be seen as, well, the more developed African countries will benefit the most. But I think that mechanism really brings a good balance. And then the protocol around investment, so where you will actually have governments then make sure that from a policy regulation perspective, you know, there's certain measures in place that would give confidence to investors to know that they, you know, their investments are protected. So there is practical things that have been done and continue to be done that I think gives that encouragement. What we really need to see the AfCFTA Secretariat push harder on is these non-tariff barriers, and the non-tariff barriers are particularly linked to infrastructure, energy security, and energy security and how it links to climate change. I think 2024 was a year that we really saw that directly impact in energy security, practically with the drought that we experienced in the southern Africa region. We had a Zambia go from full coverage electricity to like 12-hour load sheddings daily because of the impact that the drought had on the Kariba Dam, which was the hydropowering and therefore the supply. So I think when you talk just transition, that's a very practical sort of example, you know, what we saw last year, that in how we think and the policy recommendations, even for G20, but including the AfCFTA, something that we have to very intentionally start to think about how, when we're addressing the non-tariff barriers on infrastructure, how we start to mitigate even for climate impact. Because I think the just energy transition really sort of brings that to life, that you can't have the reliance on just one source of producing energy, and really look at what makes sense then for each country and what the resources that they have.
And therein, again, showing and not just talking, because they're speaking to the next phase really for Africa, right? We'll talk about the potential of Africa. And that's often what happens at meetings or gatherings like the G20. We talk about the potential of Africa. And yet now we need to start showing the impact that Africa can have. And the hope is that that really will be done this year with Cyril Ramaphosa having that G20 presidency. Do you see that translating? Is he pushing enough that, you know, yes, see potential in Africa, but also see the great things that are happening on this continent, so that you can have confidence, so that you can invest and really see Africa for what it is?
Yeah, no, true. You know, I want to bring you to the Brazilian G20, and particularly the B20 and what they did. And it's encouraging to see that from what the South African president has announced around what they will focus on and some of what they want to put in place, being a cost of capital commission under the G20. So Brazil, as part of the G20, the B20 actually looked at the same task forces that are currently there for the B20 in SA. But there was a particular focus to say, okay, we need the two pressing points. Our SMEs, too many of them, there's too much attrition there. What do we need to do for them? And so one of the measures that they instituted, which became, like regulation in country, was how quickly SMEs get paid. So they actually instituted that in place, and it was one of the practical things that actually came out of that. Another one that I particularly was excited to read about was that when looking at the finance and infrastructure task force, they then said, okay, we are talking about how what must be done around enabling more finance and then infrastructure. Let's actually look at projects in the country. Let's not look for new projects, but the current ones underway, and how do we rally and mobilize financial capital towards that. And that being then, let's look at blended finance structure, let's look at participation of DFIs. And so that was for me a very practical way that we had this presidency, we talked, but there also were things that were being done. And when it came to the end of the G20 year, we are still doing things that actually emanated out of that. So I think what would be good for the South African presidency to consider is what would that look like for an SA. And it could be things that we do beyond in SA or even in the rest of the continent. And I think that will be a real good lesson to take from our colleagues from Brazil and how they approached the G20 presidency.
Well, that leads me so nicely into what I'm going to ask you next, is because I know it's early days,
Yep.
but we are going to come to December and we're going to have to rate our participation in G20
Yep.
and all the things we set out. What are some of those practical examples you'd like to see come to the fore come December when we hand over the reins to the US?
I think it'll be good to actually see the recommendation, not just the recommendation, but the intention of this cost of capital commission actually being put in place with a very clear mandate in what it will do and how it will enable the work of looking at cost of capital, especially for emerging economies and developing markets. I think one of the other ones would be good to the policies that are currently being discussed and are being formulated, what will be cross-cutting and what will be thematically sort of, this is really going to shift things, for the emerging economies. And that must be a very crystal clear one. And then how then do the different sort of players, especially from a finance perspective, in the finance value chain, like your multilateral development banks, DFIs internationally, regionally, then play a part in that. What would their role be? And I think those would be for me the critical ones that really would, be something that gives a good tick to what the year would have yielded, and something that has a continuance. When the US takes over the presidency, we've been very encouraged to see in the B20 representation from the US, very committed to the process, and I think that gives a good sort of intention of some of the recommendations, especially coming out of that B20 that will be carried through into their presidency.
Yeah, I do speak a lot about the onus on Ramaphosa in the G20, but that's not to sideline that in the B20 there are African and South African companies as well. Do you believe that from a business perspective, we're also all singing from the same hymn sheet, if we can say that, about the potential and the work being done in Africa to really encourage and put forward a message that Africa is open for business, and we've got some challenges, but this is how we're working on it, etc. Do you believe business is supporting this idea? Are you getting that sense in the B20 task forces that are out there?
Yeah, look, we at the B20 launch, my takeaway it was that there's general positive and commitment towards what the intention is of the B20 focus this year. in addition to, sleeves are rolled up, how do we actually bring our contribution to it? So I had no doubt walking away from that B20 launch week, some of the conversations, but also the engagements and the discussions that we had with the task force chairs. And perhaps this would help to really land that point when it was open for the business community, who wants to then get involved with the task forces. I think there was around per task force around 150 spots, and the applications they received was almost 3,000. So that tells you these are C-suite level captains of industry that are saying, I want to be part of that. I want to add a voice to what this shapes up to. So I think it's not just a sentiment to walk away with. It was truly sort of experience even beyond that, and just how the business community has been engaged, and that's a business community both locally and internationally. So the rest of the continent and the other regions that are representative of the G20 countries. So that has been very encouraging to see leaders from other countries, regions, really saying that South Africa, it's your turn, and we're here and want to contribute. So I think you have that, and I think that's what's very exciting. And there's a very good structure being set up, led by the Sherpa, on how that's going to feed into the G20. And I think currently how that's been set up and the learnings have been taken from the Brazilian process, the India process, the team has done very well to set up the South African process quite well and transparently, and also just ensure the good participation from our industry leaders.
And again, like you're highlighting there, not just talk, actual action, people getting involved, rolling up their sleeves. But on that note, Luthando, thank you so much for your time today. It will be interesting to see how it all plays out over the coming months, and we'll be touching base again with you, I'm sure. But for today, let's leave it there. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Luthando Vuba is the head of international trade at the Business and Commercial Banking Unit at Standard Bank. And that's where we leave things for now, but be sure to stay tuned to Business Day TV, as we'll be covering the G20 in depth over the course of the year, bringing you unique insights and thought-provoking commentary on the themes and news flow that emerges from the grouping. So there's lots more to come on the channel, and we'll see you back here for that.